Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
We're really happy to welcome Jillian, who's come up from Nottingham. And Jillian is within the School of Animal, Rural and Environmental Sciences at Nottingham Trent. But we were having a chat beforehand, and Jillian was explaining she isn't based in Nottingham. She's based in a rural town, Southwell, outside Nottingham, and that's where her interest in flooding began, and Jillian will explain that herself in a moment. But we're really happy to welcome Jillian, and I'll hand you over.
Okay. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay if I speak at this level? Is that all right? So thanks ever so much for inviting me along. I feel slightly embarrassed because there are so many people in Newcastle who know so much about flooding that it seems a bit strange that I've come from Nottingham. But anyway, hopefully I can say one or two things that might spark some thoughts and discussion, and hopefully you can share some experience and thoughts as well. Wanted to start off by talking really about my background, just very, very briefly. So I'm a geographer by background. I've mostly worked on river and stream flows, done a lot of work in the Peak District, further south. I've worked quite a long time in Cumbria with the Environment Agency, doing various projects on river flows around there. I've worked on most of the major rivers in Yorkshire, again with the Environment Agency, and in East Anglia. I really haven't worked in this area at all. So as I say, I'm not coming here as an expert on flooding in Newcastle. Can I just ask, just wave your hand, have any of you had direct experience of being flooded in your own houses? No. Oh, okay. So it's something that when people do experience it, really changes their lives. It really makes a huge amount of difference to them. There's been quite a lot of work around the whole issue of sort of mental health, and that actually the experience of being flooded in your house can have a real negative impact going forward. It can make people very anxious. It can lead to depression. It really is something that has potentially very negative impacts on the individuals who experience it. And I asked Lorraine how she found out about me. She heard me on the radio in December 2015. And that was when, do you remember, there was Storm Desmond and Storm Frank happened over the Christmas period, the Boxing Day floods. So those floods, just over that one little period, affected about 16,000 people in their homes. And I was nearly one of those. So I work at Nottingham Trent Uni, but actually my family are in West Yorkshire. And our house there is on the banks of the River Calder. Well, there's a road in between, but it's pretty close to the banks. And we were very close to being flooded. The Calder at that particular place reached the highest it had ever got. And my understanding, looking down at my notes very briefly, is that the Tyne at the same time also got, I think, to the highest it had been. So you know, it was quite an unusual event. I say 16,000 properties were affected just in that one period. And if you look at what the government have to say, and in the Houses of Parliament, the EFRA committee, that's the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, they say about 5 million people in England are at risk of flooding. And it's not the first time that this has happened, and it won't be the last time that we get experience. I'm mostly talking about river flooding. Obviously, there are also coastal floods that happen, but my work is very much around river flooding. My understanding in Newcastle is that you had a big river flood in 2012. Anybody remember that one? It was Surface water rather than river. Okay, right, yeah. So surface water is another issue again, quite tricky to deal with, because sometimes it's quite hard to predict where that's going to happen, if it's related to drains and sewers and so on. And sometimes the two come together. So my most recent research in Southwell was actually to do with a thunderstorm that affected the town. About 300 properties there were flooded, half of them from the river and half from surface water. So you sometimes get the two actually happening together. So back to the rivers. I think the first thing that I want to press home is how variable rivers are in time and in space. So I looked up the Tyne. It seems that Bywell is a major gauging station. People know where that is, so upstream from Newcastle. And I had hoped to pass it around on my iPad, but it seems the Wi-Fi seems not to be working very well. There's a website called Gauge Map where you can see what's happening on the river near you. And I looked at the Tyne at Bywell earlier, and it's quite low at the moment, no need to worry at all. Back in March, a couple of times, it went up by 3 metres in the space of a day or so. And potentially, when it gets in flood, it can go up by 7 metres. The water level can rise by 7 metres. And then that's when you start to get the problems occurring. And I think sometimes we just forget that rivers do behave like that. That is a natural part of the variability of the river, is that sometimes the flow will be very, very low, sometimes it'll be very, very high. And we kind of expect it to stay put and be constant, and that just isn't how we go on. And so floods are a normal part of river behaviour, that every so often about once a year, water will come out of the constrained narrow channel onto what we term the floodplain of the river. And one of the issues is that floodplains are nice flat land. They've got the river, Newcastle, obviously historically the river was very important. And we do what's sometimes called preferential development. We like to build our towns by rivers. They're good for navigation, they're good for communication, they were important for industry, they're important for drinking, all sorts of things. And so then we end up with a flood risk. And we need to think about how we're going to manage that. And one of the ways traditionally that we manage it is to try to do what's called mitigating the risk, to reduce the risk. And in terms of what our government have done recently, for the current 6-year period from 2015 to 2021, they've committed £2.5 billion. And they say that at the end of that period, 300,000 homes, properties should be better protected than they were at the beginning. If you work that out, I did the sums earlier while I was sitting drinking my tea, it's about £8,000 per property protected. Now obviously there's a lot of variation within that, but that's the kind of order of taxpayers' money that we're putting into protecting homes that are at risk. But it's not just a case of building flood management. We need to maintain it if we're going to do that. And that has additional costs. And then we have issues about climate change and potentially suggestions that we might be going to see more extreme floods in the future. So potentially costs are going to rise, potentially more people are going to be involved in those. And so something that's arisen, not just in the last few years, but has come, I think, up the agenda, is the whole idea of adaptation. Rather than trying to prevent the problem, they used to use the term flood defence, but people have moved away from that to a large extent to talk about managing floods. And that one aspect of management might be adapting our behaviour. One adaptation would be to move the cities. I don't think that's very likely to happen. We're not going to shift Newcastle up onto a hill. But maybe we can change things within a city to reduce some of the impacts of potential flooding. And another concept that you may have come across, I think, from other talks, from what Lorraine said, is the whole idea of resilience. Is that a term that people are familiar with, some of you? So resilience is this idea of being able to bounce back, and that maybe one of the things we might want to do is try to enable communities and individuals to be more resilient if they do face flooding. And I brought with me, I was told I'm not allowed any PowerPoint or anything, but I brought something to hand round. You can have a look at that if you want. So this report, that you can just have a flick and pass it on if you want, was a report that was produced in September last year at the behest of the government and DEFRA, looking at how can we make properties and individuals more resilient. Are there things that people could actually do to their houses that might lessen the impacts of flooding and make it easier for them to get back in the houses afterwards and lessen those negative emotional and mental aspects of the flooding? So there's, do we try and manage the problem, or do we try and adapt our behaviour? There's also an issue about where do we manage flooding. Lorraine mentioned about rural areas. The traditional approach to flooding was very much about managing it in the town, in the city, and it was very much about engineering, tending to put up high walls to keep the water in the river, sometimes enlarging the channel. Again, I was reading a bit about Newcastle, and one of the things that used to happen here was dredging for gravel, I believe, and there was some suggestion that they thought that would be good for flooding, but actually it didn't quite work out quite as beneficial as might have perhaps first been expected. So we could do traditional management in the city, in the river channel itself, but also, and something that's been coming up the agenda as far as DEFRA and this government and the last one, is the idea of, can we try and manage not just the channel in the city, but the whole catchment? And this is one of the areas that I've got involved in doing some research with, is looking at what's happening upstream. Can we manage the land? And it's still something that there are quite a lot of questions about. You've got somebody at Newcastle University called Paul Quinn, who's doing a lot of work. Has anybody come across him at all? Yep. So he's doing a lot of work in a village called Belford, but also in other places, I think, looking at ways of managing the water on farmers' fields, for example. Can you build extra ponds? Can you build dams that kind of leak but hold back some water? Can you find ways of slowing flow in the upper catchment so that instead of getting a really sharp peak on the river where it goes up quickly and comes down quickly, maybe you can spread it out so that you get a slower but smaller rise and then a gentler falling away again of the water level in the river? It's still quite controversial, and there's a lot of questions about, we know it works on a little local area, but can we actually make lots of little changes? Can they add together to make big changes in an important urban area like Newcastle? And there are questions about what the impacts are. Does it work well for little floods, but doesn't work quite so well for the larger floods? So it's something that the government are currently investing. I keep saying about the government. Of course, when I started thinking about this talk maybe a month ago, it was a slightly different scenario than we have now. And one of the issues about managing floods is that it's very much at the whim of the politicians. What they decide to spend their money on and what priorities they put influences what's going to happen in our towns. And they are quite prone to pressure from particular groups. There have been some groups in the country who've been quite effective at getting their voice heard. I don't know if any of you remember the Somerset Levels about 3 years ago. There was a lot of quite long-term flooding there, but actually relatively few properties were flooded, but they were very effective at getting their voice heard and getting money. Sometimes there have been other areas that have been flooded where the sort of pressure groups have not been quite so effective. So there are lots of social and political aspects to managing floods. It's not purely a matter of the science of managing the water. So the managing upstream, we sometimes refer to it as natural flood management. We've been doing some of that on our campus in Southwell. We've built some ponds. We've re-excavated an old stream channel that had been turned into a ditch by a previous farmer back in the 1950s. We've put some dams in. We have also put some earth embankments on the field corners to catch the water and just hold it back for a few hours, just to slow it down before it gets in the river and then floods the town. So lots of options like that in rural areas. What you've had in Newcastle, from what I understand, is an approach that's sometimes referred to as sustainable urban drainage. You may have seen various kind of depression areas, sometimes referred to as swales, some ponds, some things like that. Newcastle's been part of a project called Blue Green Cities, and there's been quite a lot of work by Colin Thorne at Nottingham University, has been involved with it, and various other people, about looking at not just managing upstream, but in the town. Can we do things that would have multiple benefits, that would actually make the town a nicer place to live, maybe have benefits for habitat, maybe have benefits for noise reduction, for just allowing people green spaces. And I did jot down some names of places. So Newcastle Great Park seems to be one of those that you can probably contribute more than I can about that. And green areas in Wingrove. So you've had in your city some experience of some of these kind of approaches. Are those multiple benefits worth doing? Is that something we should be investing more in? I don't think many people would say that we should scrap the old traditional measures and just do the green touchy-feely ones. But if we start trying to do both, it's going to cost more. And how do we prioritise those decisions? I think that's one of the real questions. And that sort of leads me into the more social and political things a bit. Whose responsibility is it to manage flooding? Is it a national responsibility? The EFRA committee said what we need is a national flood commissioner who will be in charge and solve all the problems. We don't have that at the moment. We have a better system, arguably, than we did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there were lots of floods in 2007, and it was very patchy who was responsible, and a big report was written after those floods that said we really need to get more joined up. But we still have the Environment Agency dealing with floods on major rivers, what's called Main River, and often the local authority. So I think that would be the City Council here, acting as lead local flood authorities for the non-Main River, for the slightly smaller rivers and streams. So issues of who's responsible, national, local, or is it individuals? You know, when the 2015 floods happened, on the TV, they interviewed some people in York. And this couple said, well, we heard there was a flood warning, and we went to bed at 10:30 at night, and then we woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and our furniture was crashing around. It was floating on the ground floor. And nobody from the Environment Agency came to help us or to move the furniture. And I have to say that, I mean, clearly there would be some people who can't help themselves because they won't physically be able. But part of me thought, you heard the flood warning and you went to bed. Isn't that a bit like leaving your front door open and then blaming the police?